Good afternoon. My name is Tom Wright. I'm a fellow and director of the Project in International Order and Strategy here at Brookings and a fellow at the Center for the United States and Europe. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone here today for a discussion on the Russia-China relationship. We're delighted to host Bobo Lo for the Washington, D.C. launch of his new paper with the Lowy Institute in Sydney called A Wary Embrace on the Russia-China relationship. Bobo is a non-resident senior fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy and an associate research fellow with the Russia Center at the French Institute of International Relations. He is the author of many books and articles, including Russia and the New World Disorder, which is available for purchase outside in the bookshop. But particularly, we want to draw attention to this new paper, Wary Embrace, which is available online at the Lowy Institute website and also from online retailers. We'd like to thank Michael Fullalove, director of the Lowy Institute, who's also a non-resident and a close friend of the Brookings Institution and was a fellow here a few years ago, and to the Lowy Institute for all of their cooperation with us here and for choosing us here today to launch this important paper. So Bobo is going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes and outline the broad arguments of the paper, and then we're joined by a stellar panel. Yun Sun of the Stimson Center, David Gordon, former Director of Policy Planning and now at the Eurasia Group, and my colleague Philippe Lecour from the Center on the United States and Europe. So I think we have a hashtag that you can tweet out, Russia-China, if you have any comments during the talk, and then we'll open it to questions and answers with about 25 or 30 minutes to go. So without further ado, perhaps I could call on Bobo to come up to the stage and to talk about his paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate seeing you all here, especially since it's such a wonderful spring day in Washington, D.C. It has become commonplace in recent years to assert that the Russia-China relationship has never been better, that their views on the international system, on the world order, are identical or near identical. Now, there's a fair bit of truth to this. It's certainly true that Beijing and Moscow agree on many things. They agree on a world order in which the United States is counterbalanced by other great powers. They both oppose Western liberal interventionism. And they certainly believe in consolidating regime stability in the face of democratic and other external pressures. On the specifics also, they appear to hold largely congruent views on issues ranging from Ukraine through Syria to the South China Sea, cyber sovereignty. And it's certainly the case also that there are no serious disputes between Beijing and Moscow. And even by the standards of the general bonhomie that you get between world leaders these days, the personal chemistry between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin certainly appears far better than most. So, in many respects, the China-Russia relationship has emerged as the very model of a modern strategic partnership, or what some people like to say, a new model of international relations. And yet, in my view, the currently popular thesis that this is an authoritarian entente, an authoritarian international, I think is overblown. And I think it overlooks critical differences between Chinese and Russian positions in four main areas. And these differences are not just trivial, because they undermine their capacity and will to develop an alternative world order with its own particular rules of the game. These differences are evident in four main areas. Their perceptions of the existing international system, their visions of a future world order. Their attitudes towards cooperation, towards engagement with the United States, and in their differing priorities in the Asia-Pacific region. So let's start off with the perceptions of the existing international system. Although China and Russia agree that the US-led global order is unsatisfactory in many respects, they diverge, crucially, in their overall assessment of its worth. Moscow's view. Moscow's attitude towards the existing international system is unequivocally negative. It sees a system that was imposed on Russia against its will as the loser in the Cold War, and that has systematically deprived it of its justified place in the world, of its influence, of its rightful status. It believes, on the positive side, if you're looking from the Kremlin, that this US-led order is also in terminal decline, and that its demise should therefore be expedited. And so to this end, it has sought to undermine it through various means, such as discrediting the democratic process in the United States, making common cause with far-right populist parties in Europe, and military intervention in Ukraine and Syria. The Chinese, by contrast, do not seek the demise of the existing international system, but rather its reform. They recognize implicitly and actually explicitly that US leadership and Western-style globalization has actually been extremely kind to China, helping to transform it from a regional backwater to an incipient superpower in just over 3 decades. So if Russia has been the biggest casualty of the liberal world order, then China, by contrast, has been its prime beneficiary. And what this means is that China has a vested interest in the preservation of the international system, albeit with some changes that would reflect China's much enhanced influence and status in global affairs. Beijing also worries about process. It worries about the anarchy that might ensue from the shift from the current, admittedly unsatisfactory system to a much more unpredictable New World Order. And it also worries about the additional responsibilities it would have to carry in such a world order. It fears an escalation of international tensions. And it also realizes, I think quite rightly, that an overt challenge to US primacy would increase the chances of Sino-American confrontation, particularly at a time when China is nowhere near ready for this. That's the first major difference between China and Russia. Second difference, whose multipolar order? Now, Beijing and Moscow talk a lot about a new multipolar order, or to use a fashionable parlance, polycentric system of international relations. But they differ in their visions of this multipolar order. Moscow identifies, in essence, 3 independent centers of global power: the United States as the leader of the West, China as the leader of the East, and Russia as the great transcontinental heartland power, if you like, balancing between the United States and China and being a bridge between East and West. Beijing's vision, however, is substantially different to this. I would say Beijing subscribes to a bipolar plus vision. So the United States is still preeminent, yes, but China has emerged as the only true counterpart, global interactor with the United States. The Sino-American relationship would be the fulcrum of global governance in the 21st century. And as for Russia, in this Chinese vision, yes, Russia would be important, certainly. It would be a great power, absolutely. But it would not be a power on a par with the United States and China. That's a critical difference. Now, such differences, such contradictions have been blurred by the gathering crisis between Russia and the West in recent years. Nevertheless, there is a clear tension, in my view, between Putin's view of Russia as a global power on a par with the United States and China on the one hand, and on the other hand, the mainstream Chinese assessment of Russia as a secondary power, one of several adjuncts to the main US-China global relationship. And I think these differences of perception are likely to become more significant as the gap between Chinese and Russian capabilities widens in coming years. Third difference. Beijing and Moscow agree that Washington is to blame for much of the instability and iniquity in the world today. However, they also engage with Washington in very different ways. For China, the United States stands at the epicenter of its foreign policy. The United States is China's strategic benchmark. It is its second largest trading partner just after the EU, and it is a primary source of technology and know-how. Accordingly, Beijing identifies, as I mentioned earlier, a powerful vested interest in maintaining at least a functional relationship with Washington, however serious their differences may be on individual issues. Now, we should acknowledge that this is not a guarantee against confrontation, but it does mean that the Chinese default position towards the United States is essentially one of cooperation and accommodation, finding ways to get on. Now, it's also true that the United States is the primary strategic reference point for Russia, but that is actually where the similarities end, because the Russia-US relationship, the bilateral relationship, is meager. It is dominated by contentious security issues such as, well, conflict management in Syria, as we've seen. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a tactical and opportunistic interaction at best, and one that is, as we have seen, more often than not, highly acrimonious. Now, it's true that Donald Trump has declared his intention to improve relations, but let's be honest, real rapprochement is pretty unlikely given the well-publicized scandals over Russian cyber hacking in the US presidential election, the, how should we say it, dubious contacts between senior Trump figures and Russian security services. So what this has meant is that bipartisan opposition, Republican and Democratic, in Washington to a better relationship with Moscow, I think is actually hardening. And while initial optimism in Moscow that somehow Trump would magic up a better relationship, well, those hopes have largely disappeared. Fourth difference. This really is we would say mainly about Australia, but it's because the United States is very much an Asia-Pacific power, it's highly relevant, but sometimes a little bit neglected. China, as we've seen, is committed to asserting itself as a leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, specifically, this means promoting its interests in relation to Taiwan, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and on the Korean Peninsula. More generally, the Chinese agenda, it seems to me, is about challenging US regional primacy, weakening Washington's security relationships with Seoul and Tokyo, isolating Japan, and projecting Chinese naval power throughout the Western Pacific. Now, this is an ambitious and comprehensive strategic agenda any way you look at it. By contrast, the Russian agenda is limited and prophylactic. Its main strategic priorities lie elsewhere: Eastern Europe and post-Soviet Eurasia, the Middle East, the Arctic, and of course, the creation of a new global order. If Moscow has any sort of strategic vision for the Asia-Pacific, then it is for an environment where no single power is able to dominate. And that means China. Moscow doesn't want to just see the end of US hegemony. It just wants to see an end of hegemony full stop. So the idea that somehow it'd be more acceptable for China to take the United States' hegemonic role in the Asia-Pacific, that has no meaning in Moscow. So what does this mean for the nature of the Sino-Russian partnership? Well, Moscow and Beijing have shown very little capacity to coordinate on grand strategy, or let alone to establish so-called post-Western norms and institutions. These, ladies and gentlemen, are independent actors. They are not allies. It's true that they've been quite successful in developing bilateral cooperation and also in managing their differences. But this does not equate to a commitment for global transformation on agreed terms. This is not an authoritarian entente, but a relationship of strategic convenience driven by individual national priorities and interests. Nevertheless, we should acknowledge that this Sino-Russian partnership is resilient, and the likelihood of significant shifts, one direction or another, I think is quite low. Beijing and Moscow recognize the flaws of their relationship, but they also recognize that cooperation is a much better option for each side than confrontation or even tension. And this means that they are committed to sustaining their strategic, or what's known as a strategic partnership, committed to making it last. And people wonder about, well, what is the Trump effect in all this? I think Trump's shenanigans, continuing uncertainties in Europe, have actually served to strengthen Sino-Russian engagement. Because at a time when there's so much volatility and there's so much uncertainty, you can never take anything for granted anymore. Then Beijing and Moscow look to each other for a sort of relative predictability, relative stability, for all the shortcomings and defects in their relationship. However, conversely, China and Russia are most unlikely to upgrade their partnership to a bona fide alliance. Why? Well, for a start, the risk of dangerous entanglements from Europe to the Asia-Pacific remains a powerful disincentive. Instead, I believe, Putin will continue in his attempts to position Russia as the great middle power, an independent center of global influence and authority. And I think Xi, for his part, will strive to ensure that China's rise to superpowerdom is as smooth and harmonious as possible. So the big question looking ahead is whether China and Russia can build on the progress of the past 2 decades and achieve a more deep-rooted convergence, even if it's not an alliance. And I think there's good reason to be skeptical. The challenges are enormous. The challenges of the growing inequality, politely known as asymmetry in the relationship, an increasingly ambitious and globalist Chinese foreign policy, and contrasting visions of global governance. These are not trivial differences. They are enormous, and they will require immense political will and, frankly, good luck if they're to be negotiated successfully. Finally, just on some policy implications for the West. At the risk of stating the obvious, Western decision makers need to draw the right lessons from the course of China-Russia relations. And I think the first of these lessons is the requirement for balance, to avoid overreacting to individual events, be they military exercises, summits, so-called landmark energy agreements. It is essential for Western policymakers to assess each development on its merits and to maintain a sense of proportion rather than be dazzled by the spectacle, to not be shocked and awed, if you like. Second conclusion, Western policymakers need to understand the limits of their influence. There's very little, let's be honest, that they can say or do to affect the Sino-Russian relationship. The idea that somehow you can pull Russia away from China or China away from Russia, frankly, is absurd. In fact, the more we try, the more it will encourage Beijing and Moscow to use their partnership as leverage in other areas. And finally, and perhaps the most important lesson of all, we need to treat China and Russia as individual great powers. So, China's rise poses tremendous challenges to the Asia-Pacific region and to global governance in general, no doubt about it. Equally, an aggressive Russia asks serious questions about the stability of the international order. However, their contrasting perspectives, their different priorities, and sometimes conflicting interests mean that the Sino-Russian partnership is less than the sum of its parts. Thank you.
Dave. So thank you for that terrific presentation. I really liked this paper. In fact, it's not really a paper, it's actually a book. When you order it, you get it in a book format. It's the length of a book, and I highly recommend it. And I think it's interesting when we talk about this topic. I think once you bring up Russia and China, everyone wants to channel their inner Henry Kissinger, right, and reach back to their realist sort of education and see about splitting one off against the other and what that might entail. And I particularly like the way you sort of showed that was that was not only unnecessary but likely to be counterproductive. We have a really great panel here to talk about this. We've had David Gordon to Bobo's immediate right, who is a senior advisor at the Eurasia Group and was previously Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and had a long and distinguished government career before that. Yun Sung, who is a senior associate with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center, but also most importantly a non-resident fellow here at Brookings, and had previously been a China analyst for the International Crisis Group in Beijing. And Philippe Lecour, who's a visiting fellow at the Center for the US and Europe here at Brookings, my colleague, and also wrote a book called China's Offensive in Europe, which is a really great analysis of Chinese EU relations. So I'm going to turn to David in a moment, but I just wanted to push you, Bobo, on one thing before we turn to the panel. And I thought you did show that Russia and China have these big differences in perception, and there are many things that would inhibit structural cooperation. And in fact, if you look back on previous authoritarian regimes, there's almost no examples, very few examples of effective authoritarian alliances, even in the Japanese-Germany case, which many people point to. But my question is does that really, matter? I mean, should we not worry about their joint activities anyway? I mean, it seems to me there is one commonality, which you referred to yourself, which is they both share the same general objective, which is in their regions they want to displace sort of the US-led security order, and they'd like to replace it with a spheres of influence system that's more 19th century in orientation. And that while, China doesn't want to play in Eastern Europe and Russia, as you said, doesn't really have an agenda for East Asia, that actually works to their advantage. And they're both in very different ways pursuing sort of revisionist foreign policies. And so I guess my question is, does that sort of mean that we need to take that joint challenge seriously, even if we are recognizing that they're not sort of meeting in closed sessions to coordinate their strategies?
As I said right at the end, I think we need to take the strategic and normative threat posed by China and Russia to the global order. We need to take that threat seriously. However, to my mind, it's not a coordinated threat. So we need to, what I worry about is that in our obsession with a Sino-Russian authoritarian alliance, so-called, that we're taking our eye off the ball. We're thinking about Russia-China or China-Russia coordination, when in fact we should be really focusing much more specifically on what China is doing or not doing in the Western Pacific and what Russia is doing in Eastern Europe. So rather than sort of worrying about, oh gosh, they've had another naval exercise, that's a distraction. That's a secondary issue. We need to keep our eye on the ball. The ball is what they are doing individually. And that's why I worry that when we throw out this narrative of Sino-Russian coordination, we're losing, we're being distracted. We're failing to grasp and therefore address the much more serious and much more direct problems.
Great, thank you. David, if I could turn to you first and just ask for your general reactions to Bobo's argument, but also if you see, real concrete room for Chinese-Russian cooperation, or what the lessons we may have learned from the last few years about the limits to that cooperation.
Sure, thank you very much. Great to be here. So I really liked Bobo's paper because I agree with the basic framework. So I'm biased. On the other hand, I do think that the Beijing-Moscow relationship is much more fraught than it would appear by just looking at the meetings and all of this. And I remember the last time I spoke at Brookings, which I think was a year and a half or 2 years ago, I brought with me a lot of data on the limitations of Chinese economic responses to Moscow's shift to look to the east after the Ukraine crisis and the imposition of Western sanctions. And part of my point was that Moscow was really disappointed in the lack of Chinese economic and commercial engagement at that time. That they thought that they had a lot more play to go back up to a Kissingerian level. They thought that they were going to be able to shift away from some of their dependence on Europe in particular, but also on the U.S. In terms of investment to go with China, and it didn't happen. So I think the points, I think Bobo's paper's basically right. Let me just add one point and talk about the one issue that I did disagree with him about. And I don't want to take Philippe's issue away from him, but I think Europe is a huge issue in which the Chinese and the Russians look at it extremely differently. And that China really seeks to deal with a coherent, successful Europe.
That's true.
And that Russia wants anything but. So that's another major issue, but I'll let Philippe talk about that in more detail. So is it really the case that there's little the West can do to influence Russia-China relations? So I had the good fortune of visiting Beijing twice between the election and the inauguration. And the overwhelming question that I was asked wherever I went, by government officials, by think tank people, by business and financial people, is, is there going to be a Russia-U.S. entente against China? And so that maybe in retrospect it looks like things that we didn't have an ability to change this, but the Chinese were quite worried that we did.
Yes.
Quite worried about that. And I pushed. I said, "Why are you so worried about this?" And it was very interesting. They said, "What's the matter with you? You're old enough to remember the last decade and a half of the Cold War, when the U.S. and China, the ends of the triumvirate of great powers, basically ganged up on the middle."
Yeah.
Well, China and Russia have shifted roles
Yeah.
since then, and they were worried about a repeat. This is in sort of Kissingerian terms of a repeat of an ends against the middle strategy among the top three, and I think it was a legitimate concern. But I think that in my mind, I think the Russia piece of this, and why hasn't there been a better relationship with Russia? I think it comes down to one very, very critical choice that the president made. President Trump sees himself as being the most pro-military president ever. And because of that, he went out and looked at who are the senior retired or senior military officers who have the most respect among their peers. And he came up with General Mattis, General Kelly, General McMaster. I think the outlier here was General Flynn, and he didn't last long. But that all of these guys bring the U.S. military remains in many ways the most anti-Russian big institution in the U.S. government. And I think that it's the willingness of the president to defer to his military advisors who are now in the cabinet on issues of foreign policy and national security that took any real rapprochement with Russia right off. When General Mattis took his first trip to Europe, went to NATO headquarters, the first thing he said was, there will be no military cooperation between the U.S. and Russia on Syria.
Yeah.
And of course, for months and months, for over a year, the diplomacy between John Kerry and his Russian counterparts had been, how do we create the political conditions for that military cooperation? So I think Russia really was shocked in this, but that's why I think that Beijing has been a little more pleased with the Trump ascendance and the form it's taking than you have suggested.
Okay. Fair enough. All right.
David, can I just do one quick follow-up? I mean, is that why Trump seems to be turning more to Tillerson on the Russia diplomacy? I mean, Secretary Tillerson seems to now be the lead.
He's the guy.
And, I agree with your assessment in terms of where the military came from, but it's sort of interesting how the president is now not quite trying to sideline them, but sort of circumvent them in a way.
No, and I think that Tillerson is the right guy to be in the lead on Russia. I mean, he's dealt with the Russians, he knows the Russians, but he's not coming from a viewpoint that's 180 degrees different from the military guys on this. But you can't have, I don't think you can have, unless you have a rapprochement, you can't have a military guy doing that because they're not going to be able to do it.
Song, if I could turn to you and ask you, like, picking up on David's last point in terms of the Trump administration and how sort of China views this. I mean, has the first 100 days changed their sort of view of both the United States and then the necessity or desirability of cooperation with Moscow? Or, is it sort of just more continuity with how they were thinking before?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I really admired Bobo's paper and his books in the past. And so on the issue of how to assess the Sino-Russian relations, I think the Chinese reaction is the question is a point of reference. What do you compare this bilateral relationship as it currently stands to? Do you compare it to Sino-U.S. relations or Russia-U.S. relations? The Sino-Russia relations today is so much better. And if you compare it to the relationship between China and Russia in the past, say from 1960s to 1990s, then the relationship today is very good.
Yes.
So that's why they would say that our relationship with Russia is at its best shape for decades at this current moment. And they would say that we have worked much more closely with Russia for much less in the past.
Yes.
So I think there's an issue of point of reference and how do you compare it. And there are a lot of differences. I know Philip is going to talk about the strategic competition between Russia and China, given China's Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia. And there are quite a lot of disagreements between the two. And then on the issue of the Trump effect, I agree with Bobo that I don't think the Chinese is immediately changing their policy on Russia. That since the external threat or the perception of an external threat by the United States in the case of East Europe and in the case of West Pacific has been a key element that brought this rapprochement between China and Russia, especially since 2013, since Xi Jinping assumed the power. Then the logic naturally continues that now that China has better relationship with, presumably has better relationship with the United States under President Trump, then that, at least on China's part, removed some of the willingness to cooperate as closely with Russia. But I don't think that is a policy position that Beijing is taking today. That one, Beijing doesn't want to appear expedient or opportunistic at this point, that immediately after Trump decides to have a better policy towards China, China is turning its back against Russia. That projects an image that China does not want to have internationally. It wants to have that consistency. And also from the Chinese judgment, although that President Trump seems to be pursuing a transactional relationship with China on some of the issues today, when they look at the long run, they still feel that U.S. inevitably will see China as a long-term competitor. So this U.S.-China relations in the long run remains to be competitive. So from that angle, they feel that, well, Russia offers us more stability and more predictability in terms of our policy. The interesting issue is on specific issues when, say, at the current moment, when Trump administration requests Chinese cooperation or Chinese consent on some of the issues. Then what is Beijing's choice? How Beijing reacts to that when Beijing has a transactional mindset in dealing with Trump? And there are two interesting examples from April. The first one is the Chinese abstention on the Syria resolution at the UN Security Council on April 12th. So that came out as a surprise because China has cast a double veto with Russia for 6 times in the past, and the most recent one being the end of February. And actually the day before the Mar-a-Lago summit between President Xi and President Trump, the Chinese representative at UN had made a quite assertive and spicy criticism of the Western position on the Syria issue. So I think people were expecting that China would cast another veto with Russia on the issue of Syria, but China did not. And what that means to me is that China is trying to subtly differentiate or cater to U.S. demand, at least on some of the issues. It doesn't mean that they're going to change their policy on Russia completely, but on tactical issues and technical issues, I think the Chinese are willing to see whether there's a leeway. And the second event, or the second example, is last Friday, Russia announced that they're banning the popular Chinese social media app WeChat in Russia. And the official explanation for that is WeChat was not following the rules and the management regulations inside Russia. And you see the Chinese Russia specialists coming out saying that, well, this is not a political issue. It doesn't carry any political message. It's just a legal matter and a commercial matter. But you would think that between Beijing and Moscow, if their relationship is really as good as they describe, then such a contentious issue would have been handled more privately rather through such a high-profile method. So I think those subtle events does convey some message that on tactical and technical issues. I think under the Trump's overall positive policy towards China, the Chinese will take his demand into consideration.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Thank you. Philippe, if I could turn to you, and you wrote a great book on China's engagement in Europe, particularly on sort of the economic side, and you've also looked at the Central Asia component of it. I'm just wondering, how do you see all of this fitting together, and do you sort of also share sort of the view that there's real limits to this cooperation, or how do you see the Chinese dynamic really playing out in the European context?
Well, first of all, I have to add my compliments to the author of the paper. I think it was a very balanced view on and very accurate of the Russia-China relationship. And just to follow up on what Yun Sun was saying, it's interesting that the Chinese social media are now banned in Russia. As we know, there's nothing political about banning social media, even in China. It's all economic and technical. Anyway, social media. So to answer to your question, Tom, more directly, I think one of the things that Bobo pointed out in his paper is the fact that the Chinese agenda is very much about geoeconomics rather than politics or strategic.
In Europe?
I mean, globally.
Oh, globally.
Globally. First, I mean, you have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is convening a massive summit in a few days in Beijing. The AIB, which is this new bank, infrastructure bank that has been launched by Beijing. And on the other hand, you have the Eurasian Economic Union that the Russians have put together. Now, the idea behind actually both projects, I mean the Russian one and the Chinese one, is to create more possibilities for China on one hand, with all the problem of overcapacities, steel and Chinese goods in general, and for Russia to tie together the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. And of course, in Central Asia, it's a complicated matter. I mean, if you go to Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, they speak to you in Russian, and there's no evident Chinese presence there. Surely the Kyrgyz do not know that 70% of their country's debt is owned by China. In fact, there's no Chinese presence at all. It's quite surprising. On the other hand, we know that in the course of this Belt and Road Initiative, there are all kinds of projects going on, some successful, not so successful. In a place like Pakistan, for example, not so far away from Central Asia, more like South Asia. There have been, 40 workers killed along the road, or along the belt, I should say, and there was a kind of security dimension missing. So where is China going in terms of security and protecting its own project of expanding economically? Is a question. And in Central Asia, the answer to that question is very clearly, it's not going anywhere. Russia is basically the big brother when it comes to protecting the five Central Asia republics. Just one point on defense. I mean, as far as we know, China is a net importer of defense equipment from Russia. Mm-hmm. How long will that last? I mean, basically, the Chinese PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has been building thanks to Russian military equipment. And that's the main reason for that's the main flow of goods. So there's this sort of dichotomy between, security and economics. And again, coming to what David was saying and what you're saying, Tom, on China and Europe. Tom, you said that China doesn't want to play in Eastern Europe, and I beg to disagree. It is playing, but in the economic field, not in the security field, or not yet. I mean, in Pakistan, you may have to address this, other than hiring Pakistani security people. But surely in Central Asia, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, it's about building infrastructures, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is about expanding China's presence, building a high-speed train between Belgrade and Budapest, having all kinds of projects in the Balkans, in Hungary, in Poland, and getting political support from these countries as well. When in Central Asia, of course, it doesn't try because Russia is just, has a military presence, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, and it is still relied upon by the Central Asians. So there is a game going on, and obviously the majority of these Eastern and Central European countries are more on the Chinese side than the Russian side for obvious political reasons. There might be a couple of exceptions there. And also many of them are part of the European Union, which is another side subject. But China has been sort of using this opening of Eastern Europe for the past 10 years. It started with the Euro debt crisis and the fact that many of these countries feel a little bit sidelined by globalization and by mainstream Europe. And Russia doesn't have much to offer because, both in Central Asia and in Eastern and Central Europe, Russia can offer a protectorate, which in Eastern Europe doesn't interest anybody almost. When in Central Asia, because of the commonality of cultures, of language, of history, it's still very much the Russian sphere. And the Chinese know about that, and there's a kind of equilibrium between the two powers that China may have an increasing presence in Central Asia, but mainly in the economic sphere.
Interesting.
Great, thank you. So before I go back to Bobo, if I could just throw out another question just for anyone who cares to answer it. But it just strikes me that with the Trump administration, that Russia and China, even if they're both acting separately, both have sort of a tremendous opportunity here that's sort of on the, would work to both of their advantages in two respects. The first is, it really does seem that for the first time, maybe since the war, there's a president who cares not one little bit about democracy promotion or human rights or sort of the values component of U.S. foreign policy, which of course is something that the Chinese and the Russians have been very aggravated about for some time. And, while they may not be actively proposing sort of an authoritarian model, they can, to spread around the world, they can help consolidate authoritarianism where it arises. And the second area is that there is a doubt about, I think still the U.S. security commitment in both of these regions. President Trump has still not explicitly endorsed Article 5 of the NATO treaty, even though he has said NATO is no longer obsolete. And there was a report the other day that FONOPs have yet to start in the South China Sea, that may be linked to the North Korean threat. And so I'm wondering if you could all just sort of reflect on that sort of dynamic. Are we seeing sort of a fundamental game changer here with Trump presidency in terms of, if not a Russia-China alliance, at least their joint sort of challenge, Bobo, that you mentioned? David, do you want to?
Yeah, so, I do think that this issue of reassuring allies, which was what all of these guys in the national security positions of the government wanted to do, right? And they were worried about it because, of course, during the campaign and for 30 years before that, Trump had basically bad-mouthed the Western alliance system. And he continued doing it during the campaign. And the interesting thing is when he found these generals who were so well respected, what they had in common was a deep belief in the alliance system. And so there's certainly been an effort to reassure, but the effort to reassure has inevitably run up against the president's proclivity, because I think one of his strongest held beliefs is that America's allies basically screwed the U.S. in terms of burden sharing. And I think he holds that belief very, 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 very powerfully. So it rubs up against this quest for reassurance. And I think that tension is going to be semi-permanent over the course of the administration. I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think it's going to be resolved one way or the other. And I do think that will create opportunities for alternative powers. Now, will that lead the Russians and the Chinese to work more closely together? I suspect not, because I think Bobo's point, particularly about Asia, about the Russians not wanting the Chinese to take over from the U.S. role is very strongly held. But everybody's going to be hedging, right? So you're going to have a lot more hedging, including with the Russians by a country like Japan.
Yes.
So I do think there's an opening here. I don't think it's going to end. I don't think we're going to get to an equilibrium in terms of the resolving of this tension around alliances in a way that is the status quo ante. I don't think that's where we're heading, and that will definitely create openings.
Great, thank you. Bobo, do you want to come back in on that, or on all of the various comments?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. There's fascinating. Thank you very much. These are really interesting comments, and I can't possibly do justice in my responses to them, but I'll try and pick up a few points. Let's start off with the last one about whether a Trump administration, the Trump presidency, does create certain tactical and strategic opportunities for China and Russia. I think yes and no. Okay, what do I mean by that? There are two major elements in play. One is the sheer volatility of Donald Trump himself, sheer unpredictability, which makes calculation not just by US allies difficult, but by US enemies or US rivals. So really, it's almost like everything's been thrown up in the air. Everything that you kind of betted on about the rules, good or bad, the rules of the international game, have now become suspect, have now become unsafe. So that means you can count on nothing. He may support your line on a particular issue today, but tomorrow it might be different. And if you hang around long enough, it'll come full circle. So this makes strategic or tactical calculus extraordinarily difficult for enemies, rivals, and friends. But there is another aspect, which is that there's an argument that the adults are back in charge. That you've got McMaster, you've got Mattis, you've got Bannon, we think maybe on the outer, at least on these issues, and you've got Tillerson, and that there is a certain sort of underlying pragmatism. So basically, Trump can say or think whatever he likes, but these adults who are actually running the show will ensure a certain continuity in US policy. So these are two contradictory trends, but very hard to pick. Now, I actually think the biggest problem, the strategic opportunity that arises from the Trump administration, is the sheer dysfunctionality of US foreign policy under Donald Trump, that the unpredictability. In other words, it's not Russia or China, let alone a Sino-Russian authoritarian entente, that is the biggest threat to the liberal world order. It's Donald Trump. So in that sense, it creates opportunities for other players to play, but except they don't quite know where the limits are. They don't know how the map is unfolding. It's an extraordinarily unpredictable environment that allows real opportunities for advantage, but also maximizes risk as well. So it's very, very difficult to play. Now, just picking up some of the other points. So you mentioned that China and Russia look at Europe very differently. And in a way, their contrasting attitudes towards Europe exemplify their broader attitudes to the international system. That China actually wants Europe to be reasonably functional because it wants, more or less, functional international system, albeit with increased Chinese influence. The Russians want to see it all go to the devil in the handbasket, really. And so they're actively disrupting processes in Europe because it fulfills a larger objective. On the Kissingerian triangle, I've always been a bit of a skeptic about the value of strategic triangularism. I actually believe that even in the heyday of the Cold War, that the US got a lot out of the triangle, China got some things, but they did not really influence Soviet behavior at all. Actually, the Soviet Union, in fact, expanded many of its activities. It put far more divisions on the Chinese frontier than it did before the strategic triangle, before Nixon's visit to Beijing. So, and these days, I actually don't think that that they have much opportunity to. I take your point that the Chinese were worried about a Russia-US rapprochement, but they were wrong, and they were wrong and in a way they were wrong because they didn't really understand the Russian mentality. They completely underestimated just how profound the Russian animus is towards the US political establishment. That the United States represents what's known as the Первый враг, the first enemy. It's the great other. It's almost like the great Satan in a way. On benchmarks, very good point. And I had an exchange with various people on the Interpreter, which is the Lowy Institute's website magazine. Benchmarks are crucial. And you're absolutely right, and so to point out that the relationship is better than it's ever been. We need to acknowledge that. It's far better than even the era of the 1950s, 40s, 50s, the so-called era of unbreakable friendship that was anything but, of course. It is more multi-dimensional, it's more developed, they know how to handle trouble better. But the reason I raised the benchmarks, why in a way I'm not dismissive, but I try to underplay things, is you have people saying that this is a Sino-Russian alliance. And we need to take that argument on. Because yes, it's vastly better than it's ever been. Yes, it's a relationship from which both sides see far more benefits than defects. Nevertheless, it is no alliance. And we need to talk up the relationship as much as it should be talked up, but also recognize its limitations. It's about balance, for goodness sake. This is sometimes people sort of have. When I wrote a Brookings book on this China-Russia relationship in 2008, and I called it an axis of convenience. And a lot of people thought that when I said axis of convenience, I meant that it was all about tactical expediency. But no, it's about tactical expediency, strategic calculus, and long views. You can't just apply a glib label to it, although you could, maybe axis of convenience is that label. But axis of convenience, what I was trying to do is convey the impression of a relationship that had a lot of complexity, that had superficial and transactional elements, but it also had elements of reasonably far-sighted thinking. And we need to understand this. And part of this sort of the way China and Russia deal with each other, what they're looking for, and this is one area where they certainly are at one, is they both prize strategic flexibility, which is why they like a good relationship with each other, irrespective of what may happen in other relationships, but also why they don't want an alliance, because that's way too committal. You know. On Central Asia, just very quickly, in Central Asia, Philippe, I think you're right about the Chinese emphasis on geoeconomics versus the Russian emphasis on geopolitics. However, I do wonder whether the equilibrium that you're talking about is actually that sustainable. Because both sides have been talking until now about a division of labor. So the Chinese do the economic influence primacy. The Russians are clearly the dominant security, strategic, political actor in Central Asia. However, the question arises, how long can this compartmentalization be sustained? Because it seems to me that the rise in China's geoeconomic influence has been so spectacular that it inevitably has geopolitical consequences. You cannot separate the political from the economic, the geoeconomic from the geopolitical. And I was at a conference in IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations, in September, where both the Russian and Chinese participants on the panel that I was moderating acknowledged that this division of labor had effectively become defunct. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. I think we'll go to the audience because we have a lot of expertise actually in the audience as well, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. So we have microphones, so if you just put up your hand, and we'll take them in twos or threes. So see Bruce in the front row, and then the gentleman halfway down. So why don't we take the gentleman halfway down and then up to Bruce? Yeah, right beside, yeah.
My name is Gerald Rose. I'm with the Executive Intelligence Review. And I address this to Ms. Sun, but others can comment on it. I think there's a vast underestimation of the philosophical implications and deep philosophical implications of what's developing on the Belt and Road. It's not just a geostrategic action. It's actually in Xi Jinping, it's a vision for the future. It's also in Russia, and there is a tremendous interest in the United States. Can we get out of the impasse of the last, 30 years? Can we get out of that? Is there a way? Tillerson raised it recently, and can we discuss a 50-year perspective? Can we actually get beyond geopolitics and actually come up with something of what is called win-win, right? I mean, that's what it said, right? Win-win, or but it means it's a revolution. It's not just merely it's a rethink. It's a complete rethink of what are our relationships that has led us to $6 trillion in war, total chaos in the Middle East, complete poverty except in a few places. China has lifted 700 million people out of poverty.
Okay,
This is impressive. Yeah, you got the point.
Yeah,
okay.
we got it. So we'll address it in one moment. Bruce.
Thanks. Bruce Jones from Foreign Policy. First of all, thank you to Bobo and to Lowy for doing this event here. I wanted to ask both Bobo and David to comment on the energy aspect of the relationship, because neither of you touched on it, but it seems to me that there's potentially a very major stake for both Russia and China in building that relationship. The building of it is extremely complicated, but I'd like you both to kind of to pick up that theme and see whether you think that's something that's going to be real or stays in the space of the rhetorical.
Fair enough.
We're actually going to take two more as well, so because we have a lot of people on the panel. So Michael, and then the gentleman over here.
Well, let me first of all just quickly say, as the director of the Lowy Institute, Michael Fullilove, how pleased we are to be here, and I want to thank Bruce and Martin and everybody at Brookings for making us feel so much at home. Can I just draw out the speakers a little bit further on the Trump effect? We saw the pretty incredible result overnight in South Korea. We're seeing effects in Mexico, in Australia. So I know we're talking about two adversaries of of the United States. But I'd like to hear a little bit more from the panel about the Trump effect on the US allies. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, just over here. Yeah.
Thomas Gomard from IFRI. So I didn't read yet your book, Bobo Lo, but your previous stuff on that. I would like to follow up on what was asked by Bruce about energy. If you can elaborate, especially on the Yamal project, which is, in my view, very important, given the fact that it's the first major project which is not funded by dollar. Mm-hmm. And it is very clearly politically motivated. So it's something which should be taken into consideration from my point of view. I know your skepticism, about this relation between China and Russia. Could you try maybe to correct this skepticism on two things? What is the importance of this relationship in the BRICS grouping? The BRICS.
Yeah.
At the origin of the BRICS, you were also skeptical.
Yep.
And since 2009, to some extent, there were impressive progress made within this grouping. And secondly, what about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Is it something absolutely not important from your point of view, or is it something on which also we can observe a sort of dynamic coming from China and Russia? Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So we'll go to Yun-Sung first, maybe, since one of the questions is directed to you, and then Philippe, David, and Bobo. And if you could all keep your answers quite short so we can get in another round questions. So feel free to ignore the toughest questions.
Of course.
Great. Can I avoid that one? Sure. On the issue of the Belt and Road Initiative, I agree with you. I think it's both a economic campaign. It's primarily motivated by the domestic need of the Chinese economy. Chinese economy has been slowing down, and it needs to absorb the excess capacity, while the domestic market has been saturated for the infrastructure development. So China is looking abroad for such a market for the Chinese capacity. So looking from that perspective, yes, it is about economics, but it also has a long-term strategic impact that I don't think anyone can deny. I think the success of the Belt and Road Initiative also depends on a lot of factors. There's a security factor that Philip mentioned. There is also an issue of the commercial viability of a lot of these projects. Indeed, China wants to generate trade and facilitate trade, but these are very expensive infrastructure projects and with very long-term loan repayment terms. So is Chinese government or the Chinese banks able to get their money's worth in the long run? I think that still remains to be seen. And there are criticisms domestically in China about this point, although people don't dare to say that publicly. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Philippe?
So yeah, I mean, the Belt and Road project, it's great. It's still very much, in progress. We don't know, in 10 years where we will be. Obviously, it's about influence. It's about setting the agenda, which I definitely find very interesting. But it's also part of, China's global rise. It's just one element, one tool, perhaps. On the other hand, China, and going back to the Moscow-Washington axis, in China, I was asked whether there was a Berlin-Washington axis. We live in this world of axis that keep changing, and at the end of the day, Beijing has recognized the fact that there is globalization. It's one of the prime countries to benefit. And in a way, the Belt and Road Initiative is wide enough, vague enough to be able to go alongside this pro-globalization agenda, which has been clearly advocated by President Xi Jinping in Davos, and that it will no doubt continue to advocate. But I think the Chinese are getting, more flexible because, exactly because as you said, Bobo, the uncertainty due to the Trump effect.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, just a couple of points. On Belt and Road, I remain a skeptic on Belt and Road. On the other hand, I don't see any strategic challenge by China to the United States in going west, where there definitely is one in the Western Pacific waters. So I think getting involved for the United States taking a more positive attitude, joining AIIB are all the right things to do. On the energy question, I think that's a big one. I mean, but in some ways, again, to my mind, it reflects some of the differences in the Chinese viewpoint and the Russian viewpoint. I mean, what China wants to do is to really diversify its range of dependencies. So it definitely wants to have an energy relationship with Russia, but it's not. It doesn't want that to be the dominant relationship. So the Russians, I think, see energy as the driver of this much closer and broader strategic relationship, and that's been the source of their disappointment, and I think will continue to be. So on Trump and allies, I mean, no one knows what the South Korean vote would have been, so it's not easy to pull out. But certainly the most egregious case of Trump personally undermining the reassurance of allies was the series of tweets last week on South Korea. There's just no doubt about that. That was just, I mean, I was blown away.
You mean the THAAD?
Sad issue.
Yeah, the THAAD and the trade. Well, it was THAAD and the trade deal. Oh my word! A week before an election. So that was absolutely extraordinary. But I think we got to be careful though, because I mean, I think that Moon was likely to have won the election even had that not happened. So we got to be really careful.
Yeah.
It was interesting too that I think Moon, in an interview with Anna Fiffield in the Washington Post last week, was actually very restrained in his remarks and basically said he agreed with Trump on all these things and that there was no difference. And it's just interesting, given the background, there, that he was trying to downplay those differences. Also, according to Bloomberg yesterday, when McMaster contradicted Trump on THAAD, he's shouted at McMaster over the phone. So that may or may not be true.
So there's definitely, I mean, there's no doubt that HR is consolidating on the national security space in the White House. Other people don't like that. They're going to the media. Yeah. So be very careful on that.
Wait, Bobo?
Okay, just several issues. 50-year perspective. The problem is that, particularly in Russia, the political situation has always been so volatile until relatively recently, until Putin really managed to consolidate his political authority. But there's a tradition in Russian political culture of thinking not about the long term, because before the long term is the short and medium term, and that's so unpredictable that you need to put your foot on that in a way. And that means that 50-year perspectives, no, that's nice. It's a nice intellectual exercise, but it has no practical validity. Win-win. When people talk about win-win, I always think there are a couple of gags going around. One is that it means China wins and it wins again. And then the other gag, it was a friend of mine had lunch with China's chief WTO negotiator, and he asked him about the meaning of win-win. And the negotiator came back to him and said, win-win, it just means you haven't negotiated hard enough. So these are, I think, Russia and also China, their respective elites operate in an essentially Hobbesian strategic world, in my opinion. Energy. In theory, this should be the relationship of the century. You have the world's largest importer of energy with the world's largest exporter of energy. What could go wrong? But it's precisely because one is an exporter
Right.
and the other is an importer that their perspectives differ radically. Because China's interest is, as been pointed out, in diversification. It doesn't want just the oil and gas and minerals. It wants to control the market. That's really key. Whereas Russia sees energy as, in a sense, like the nuclear weapons of the 21st century. Like, you're not going to drop them, but you use them to project influence and power to compensate for your weaknesses in other areas. And so it means that they have fundamentally different perspectives. Now, sometimes they can sort of get to work and it manages. But China's interest is in minimizing, yes, it wants Russian oil and gas. But if it doesn't get Russian oil and gas,
No problem.
there are lots of other options. And in fact, even if the Russians dump a whole lot of oil and gas on them, or they already do it with oil, but virtually no gas, the Chinese will still look elsewhere because there is no way they're going to put themselves in hock to the Russians. Equally, the Russians don't want to rely on China as a market. Now, right now, they don't really have a lot of options when it comes to oil in Asia. But the thing is, the ideal situation for Russia is to have markets right across the Asia-Pacific region. One of the reasons why it prefers the Altai pipeline, gas pipeline, to the Power of Siberia pipeline is because with the Altai pipeline, which is far further to the west in central Eurasia, it means that it can supply both European and Asian customers, which means it can tell the Chinese, you don't pay our price, we send the gas in the other direction. With the Power of Siberia pipeline, you're stuck. There's only one customer. And so this is the real killer. And this means that they have fundamentally different perspectives on oil and gas and commodities. Now, as I said, sometimes you can make it work, but it's a challenge, let's be honest. On the Trump effect on US allies, I think it varies. But if I had to sort of pick a common denominator, it's the creation of uncertainty, a fluidity, and it's also the delegitimizing effect on US foreign policy. And I think that is the major, not only can you not trust in US foreign policy from day to day if you're an ally, but you're also worried about that your association with such an apparently maverick individual actually carries certain reputational consequences as well for you. And so that is a real concern. On Yamal, just very quickly, I think if, and I don't think it's going to happen soon, but if there were some improvement in US-Russia relations and some loosening of the sanctions, ExxonMobil would be back in the Arctic quicker than you could say anything. Because when Exxon and Rosneft had that deal, Exxon got the choice bits, and they left CNPC with the leftovers. So the Russians don't want to the Chinese are not Russia's favored partner in the Arctic, because what the Chinese don't offer technology and know-how, not like Exxon. And also, there's always this Chinese agenda. What do they want in the Arctic, really? It's not about energy. It's actually about broader stuff. Quickly on the BRICS. The fact that we've got this big Belt and Road summit coming up shows in some ways how marginal the BRICS are to the Chinese. Because Putin sees the BRICS as a kind of an alternative a basis for alternative global governance. This is where he's actually specifically said we want to develop from a strategic dialogue into a fully fledged partnership and with proper institutions and stuff like that. Now, the Chinese are not interested in that. For them, BRICS is just another of many institutions. Useful, but certainly no alternative to the existing network of institutions. If China does have an alternative, it wants made in China alternatives, like the Belt and Road Initiative, like the AIIB. Which brings us to the SCO. The advantage with the SCO is this. The SCO doesn't do anything for regional security. So the Chinese understand this. They've tried to, therefore, make a call for things like an SCO free trade zone. The Russians, unsurprisingly, have shown absolutely no interest in this. Guess why? So, but what the SCO can do is mediate bilateral differences in a multilateral framework. In other words, just the mere fact that you meet up for the SCO summits and there's a lot of glad-handing and happy-clappy stuff going on, that carries in itself a certain value.
Thank you. That was a very rich set of responses in the panel. We're almost out of time, so unfortunately we don't have time to go back to the audience, but I would like to finish with one question, which is over the last few months, the issue that's really emerged as preeminent for the Trump administration in Asia and Europe is North Korea. And we haven't mentioned it yet. China seems to be cooperating, but despite what we were saying earlier about Russia, playing a sort of different game in Asia, Russia's traditionally been a bit of a spoiler in North Korea. Yeah. Sometimes it's intervened to sort of give overtures to Kim Jong-un when China has sort of stepped up cooperation with the United States. So I'm just wondering if you could all comment very briefly, just in literally 30 to 60 seconds each, on how you see that playing out. Is there a Russia-China, there's obviously a China component to North Korea, but what's the Russia component? How will that sort of affect U.S. national security? So if we can, if someone wants to volunteer, or we can go in reverse order. David, do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that if the North Korea issue continues to grow in salience, and if there is a pathway forward between the U.S. and China, I don't think the Russians are going to be a spoiler on this. I'm very much of that view. Yeah. Now, and that's the irony here of the Moon election, is that I think the Moon election could facilitate an easier way to reconcile U.S. and Chinese views on where to go forward on this.
Thank you. Philippe?
Yeah, just a few words. I think, Russia was part of the six-party talks for many years. It does want to play a role because it sees itself as a global power. Having said that, it is now involved in various conflicts in Ukraine, in Crimea, of course, where it's basically occupying Crimea, in Syria, and for some reason the Korean Peninsula has not been on top of the Russian agenda. Yeah. But perhaps by going back to some kind of six-party talks, which have been mentioned various times recently, Russia could actually re-engage with China and sort of legitimate the reinstallation of this concept, which has not really worked. But in any case, it's the six-party talks allowed everybody to be happy, and in a way, China would feel it would have another ally on board.
Thank you. Yun-Sung?
Well, I agree with Philip that Russia has not been a major player. It's relatively a minor player so far on the issue of North Korea. And there's a tendency on the Chinese policy community's part to point to Russia and say that, why don't you blame Russia for its food supply and food aid to North Korea? Why are you pointing at China only? But we also know that the magnitude of the Chinese support to North Korea and the trade is very different. Russia, in comparison, their trade relations with North Korea is very small, it's negligible. I think there's a tendency on China's part to conduct some sort of policy coordination with Russia on North Korea, simply because they still do see a U.S. alliance system in Northeast Asia, where U.S., South Korea, and Japan's position are sort of on the same side, and China, Russia, North Korea could sort of be on the other side. Although more recently, I think the more interesting development is the Chinese are supportive. You see the Chinese talking about, well, we support the U.S. bilateral talk with North Korea to mitigate the tension, and potentially we could have a four-party talk with U.S., China, South Korea, and North Korea. I doubt that the Chinese at this point want Japan to be in the game, given the state of Sino-Japan relations. And that leaves an interesting question for what role that China expects Russia to play in the multilateral setting.
Thank you. Bobo, final word to you.
It's very interesting. Again, another anecdote about Russia in the six-party talks. I remember must be about 10 years ago, or at least 10 years ago. I asked a senior Japanese diplomat who had been involved in these talks whether Russia actually played a nuisance value, had a certain nuisance value in the six-party format. And he said, no value, just nuisance. Now, having said that, I agree. I don't think Russia will be a spoiler. And it won't be a spoiler for a number of reasons. It won't be a spoiler because it doesn't want to upset the Chinese over an issue that is viscerally important to Beijing. It doesn't want to get involved because North Korea is seen as dirt poor.
Yeah.
And a pain in the ass. It really is. It's got far more...
Putin did invite Kim Jong-un to Moscow, right? I mean, he did.
Yes, but in a way, what the idea, well, Kim Jong-il, but I mean, it also did that with Kim Jong-il as well in the past. What they want to do is, what Russia wants in the Korean process is power, well, not that much power, but a certain influence, but without responsibility. So in other words, by playing in the six-party talks, you'll say, yes, Russia is an Asian power. Yes, Russia is a global great power. Yes, no important security decision in the world can be made without indispensable Russia. But it doesn't want it doesn't want the grief. It doesn't want the aggravation. And that's really important. Now, for the Chinese won't stop the Russians from being part of the six-party talks. Why? It's not that they need Russia to help them. In fact, on many issues, the Chinese don't need Russian cooperation. What they need, however, from Russia is not to be a pain in the ass. They don't want to repeat the Western experience of dealing with Russia, where Russia might not be able to help you, but it sure as hell can hurt you. It can obstruct your objectives. And the Chinese, they look at the Western experience and they think, yeah, no, we won't go that way. Which is why they big up Putin, they big up Russia, and they always say, it's a great global power, it's doing the right thing, in principled positions, we agree on everything, and Putin, what a guy.
Thank you. Bobo, thank you for a really terrific paper, Wary Embrace. It's available on the Lowy Institute website as well as on online outlets, Amazon, Google. Thank you to our panel for really great comments, and to all of you, and to the Lowy Institute and Michael Folilov for partnering with us today. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.